The next presentation is a remote presentation on Camille Saint-Saëns and wind instruments. And I'm looking forward to this because we wind players revere Saint-Saëns for having written music for all of us.
Good afternoon. Emanuele and I are really glad to be here with you today, and we would like to warmly thank the conference committee for allowing us to present online. In fall 2001, the Wind Instruments Museum of La Couture-Boussey in France partnered with the Parisian Institute for Musicology Research in occasion of the centenary of the death of Camille Saint-Saëns. A monographic publication in French and English was prepared, and it was then followed by a temporary exhibit at the museum. The project aimed to discover a little-known facet of a musician's personality, his constant commitment to wind instruments at a time when such interest is rather rare on the part of renowned composers.
Why an exhibition dedicated to Saint-Saëns in La Couture-Boussey? From the 17th century up until the final decades of the 20th century, the village of La Couture-Boussey was the epicenter of French wind instruments production. Situated in Normandy, this village forms, together with the neighboring towns, the Couturier Basin. The 19th century was the century of industrialization. Production in La Couture-Boussey area was at its peak during this period. The instruments and accessories made in the workshops and factories of La Couture-Boussey, Ivry-la-Bataille, Aisy-sur-Eure, and Guérin-sur-Eure were exported throughout Europe to the Americas and the colonies, sometimes without any brand name, as most of the makers worked as specialized subcontractors for large foreign brands. In La Couture-Boussey, a large section of the population was employed in instrument making. In 1840, 140 of the 620 people identified in the census, which is the 24% of the population, worked in the 15 or so active workshops. A few years later, in 1866, 10 instrument-making workshops and 7 workshops for making keys and fittings provided a living for 321 people. The small Normandy village became a real center of technical innovation, as well as a center of mass production comparable to Mirecourt, Markneukirchen, and the Vogtland for the production of violins and bows, or to Bohemia for brass instruments. For commercial purposes, the majority of instrument makers set up shops in the French capital and labeled their instrument as from Paris, while keeping their production centers in the Eure department. They took part in national and international industrial exhibitions, where they won numerous prizes and medals, which they displayed on the frontispieces of their catalogs, advertisements, and administrative documents. Among the main makers active in La Couture-Boussey at the time of Saint-Saëns, let us mention just a few: Buffet, Godefroy, Héroard, Julliot, Leblanc, Lotte, Martin, Noblet, Thibouville.
There is no evidence that Camille Saint-Saëns had direct links with La Couture-Boussey and its makers. On the other hand, the research carried out for these exhibitions has shown that indirect links, notably through the performers, were established between the composer, the instrumental production of a small Norman village, and its wind band. Camille Saint-Saëns' long musical career corresponds to one of the most innovative periods in the history of wind instrument making. From the years 1850 onwards, the composer was able to exploit the new resources available to him in his orchestral palette, especially in his concerted and chamber music works, where he was one of the first to give wind players a role as solists. The modernization of wind instruments began at the turn of the 19th century, peaked in the 30s and 40s of the 19th, and continued until the beginning of the 20th century, when the modern instrumentarium, what we know today, emerged.
This breadth of modernity that Saint-Saëns seized upon was the result of a combination of factors. First of all, it is important to note the decisive contribution of research into acoustics and the physics of sound. Secondly, colonial expansion and exploitation, facilitated by the development of commercial transportation, enabled a greater circulation of raw materials and manufactured products, as attested by the numerous regional, national, international, or universal exhibitions dedicated to the products of industry throughout the 19th century. Instrument makers used new materials to improve their instruments, notably ebony, grenadilla, and rosewood imported from Madagascar, Central Africa, India, and South America, which gradually compensated for a shortage of European species such as boxwood. They also tested the use of alternative materials as nickel silver or ebonite. These developments in terms of the materials used and construction techniques were combined with efforts to calibrate and standardize musical pitch. At the time when each city and sometimes even each individual orchestra still had its own pitch. In France, a decision was first taken in regard on 16 February 1859 and was initially limited to lyric theaters, before being rapidly extended and imposed on military bands on 26 March 1860. This led to a rapid and wholesale renewal of the instrumental stock in use throughout the country. Concomitant with these scientific and technical advances, the changing social conventions of concerts, which were held in increasingly large halls, and the revolutionary legacy of open-air musical practices led to a gradual increase in the sound power of instruments. The popularity of traveling virtuoso soloists in the first 3 decades of the 19th century also led to a demand for more powerful, more homogeneous, and more securely intonated instruments, which offer greater dexterity and allowed for the use of chromaticism and trills. It was therefore incumbent upon instrument makers to supply ever more sophisticated instruments and on composers to exploit the new expressive capacities of performers. As regards wind instruments in particular, the professionalization of military bands, the restructuring of amateur musical societies that had emerged at the end of the 18th century, and the standardization of the instrumentarium of wind and brass bands in the 1850s gave rise to a veritable frenzy of interest in these instruments. These changes in practices generated a strong commercial demand in a sector of production that was still largely artisanal, but that with the advent of new technologies, steam saws, electricity, and the development of precision engineering, was rapidly moving towards mass industrialization.
From the Tarentelle for flute and clarinet, opus 6 of 1857, until the Sonata for bassoon and piano, opus 168 of 1921, Saint-Saëns composed some 50 works dedicated to wind instruments and surrounded himself with the best performers of his time. By exploiting all the technical possibilities of the winds and their expressive richness, Saint-Saëns thus opens the way to a renewal of the repertoire. Camille Saint-Saëns' long artistic career corresponds to one of the most inventive periods in the history of musical instrument making. Flutes, oboes, clarinets, bassoons, horns, and trumpets gradually adopt the modern form that we know today. And the new families of saxophone, saxhorn, or sarrusophones, born from the intuition of genius makers, enriched the sound palette of the orchestra. Contrary to the majority of his contemporaries, Saint-Saëns took a sustained and continuous interest in wind instruments. The catalogue of his work alone is ample proof of this, encompassing some 50 titles for a wide variety of ensembles ranging from intimate chambers music with piano to more spectacular scores involving wind bands, symphony orchestra, and scores, as well as a wealth of concertant pieces. In addition to these original compositions, more than 120 orchestration or transcription of his own works were published during his lifetime, with his permission and most of the time under his authority. For both these reasons, Saint-Saëns is with no doubt the composer of a generation whose works were the most widely arranged, performed, and distributed between the years 1850 and 1920. This explains why they were and still are so popular among wind players, chamber music ensemble, wind and brass bands.
Saint-Saëns' attachment to wind instruments is closely linked to the timbre, the tone color or sound characteristics of the instrument, and the possibilities offered by combining the various instrumental timbres with each other. Saint-Saëns' natural curiosity also inspired him to develop an interest in non-European instruments. At the 1889 World Fair, for example, he admired small bone flutes with a soft, plaintive tone of Bolivian origin and expressed his regret at not being able to conduct a detailed study of exotic music. In 1911, at the Turin International, he was similarly enthralled by Somali double flute players whose workmanship and playing technique intrigued him. He was also interested in the manufacture of early Western instruments. As a pioneer in the rediscovery of the Baroque repertoire, he produced critical editions of Gluck's French operas and directed the monumental edition of Rameau's works. He was very sensitive to the sound color of historical instruments and to the techniques of playing and ornamentation that allowed for a faithful, historically informed interpretation in advance. Without ever becoming overly theoretical or dogmatic, Saint-Saëns distilled all his knowledge into his own works, which are characterized by a choice of modern instrumentation that respects each individual instrument, together with an innovative and balanced approach to orchestration. He always had a clear idea of the sound he wanted to achieve, and would not hesitate to acquire instruments and donate them to orchestra that did not already have them. For example, in 1877, he gave a sarrusophone to the Grand Théâtre in Lyon for the premiere of his opera Etienne Marcel, and in 1898, he donated an alto clarinet for the performances of Henry VIII in London. This concert was not limited to wind instruments. It extended to the entire instrumentarium, and was combined with Saint-Saëns' curiosity about new developments in instrument making. His expertise in the field of the piano and the organ is widely known, as is his decisive role in the advancement of the xylophone, which he pioneered in Danse Macabre. It is less well known that he also pioneered the use of the saxophone and the timpani without bowl, invented by Adolphe Sax, that he took an interest in experiments with the chromatic harp, and that he supported research into the abolition of transposing notation for instruments. From the 3 flutes in Symphony No. 3 in C minor to the 3 contrabass sax horns in the oratorio Le Deluge, Saint-Saëns used the full range of wind instruments in his orchestral works. Another exceptional case is the motet Super Flumina Babylonis, which Saint-Saëns composed in 1854. The original version includes, for the first time in the history of music, a saxophone chord, Two later versions, probably written around 1874, changed the number of wind instruments in the orchestral accompaniment. One requires 2 flutes, 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, 4 bassoons and 3 trombones. The other, 2 oboes, a cor anglais, 2 bassoons, 2 trumpets and 2 trombones. It is, however, regrettable that the sound of saxophone did not inspire him more in his symphonic works. A soprano saxophone is found just once in the Monaco version of Dejanire in 1911.
Saint-Saëns did not pursue his quest alone. Very early on, he surrounded himself with leading performers who provided a source of inspirations and enabled him to achieve his sound ideal. Works for wind instrument generally occupy a marginal place in the catalogues of late 18th and 19th century composers, often limited to a few isolated examples, which more often than not owe their existence to the encounter between a composer and an exceptional instrumentalist. If we focus on the clarinet repertoire alone, we can now appreciate the influence of Anton Stadler on Mozart, of Heinrich and Karl Bergmann on Carl Maria von Weber and Felix Mendelssohn, of Richard Mühlfeld on Johannes Brahms. While Saint-Saëns' works for wind instruments is driven by the same dynamic of encounters, contrary to the previous examples, it is observed consistently throughout its career, extends to a variety of instruments, and is built in collaboration with some 15 virtuoso performers and players, with sometimes conflicting aesthetics and playing techniques. For example, he worked with 3 successive generations of horn players, such as Jules-Léon-Antoine Allary, Jean-Henri Garrigue, and Henri Chaussier. The aesthetic debates in France between the supporters of the natural horn and the chromatic horn are well known. Saint-Saëns did not hesitate to defend the Henri Chaussier's omnitone horn, for which he wrote his Morceau de Concert, opus 94. It did not prevent him from also writing a romance, opus 36, for his rival Garrigue, showing not the opposition but the complementarity of the two sound aesthetics, each with its advantages. With the notable exception of the Fantaisie for clarinet and orchestra of 1860, now lost, and the Morceau de Concert for horn and orchestra, opus 94 of 1887, Saint-Saëns wrote few concerto works that showcase the technique or virtuosity of the performer. Saint-Saëns' modernity thus lies in the fact that he succeeded in creating a concerto repertoire for wind instruments that will henceforth place more emphasis on the expressive characters of the playing than on a technical virtuosity. Saint-Saëns' own works contributed to a profound renewal of the genre and the forms of the chamber music repertoire for wind instruments and paved the way of the entire new generation of composers. He collaborated, for example, with 4 successive generations of flutists, such as Louis Dorus, Paul Taffanel, Léon Fonbonne, or Gaston Blancard, and worked in close collaboration with several wind chamber music societies, such as the famous Société Classique or the Société de Musique de Chambre pour Instruments à Vent.
It is, however, in the field of wind and brass band repertoire that Saint-Saëns was at his most innovative. From the 1830s onwards, the gradual professionalization of military bands and the proliferation of civilian musical societies had a decisive impact on the industrial development of instrument making. As a result, they also led to the emergence of a prolific repertoire distributed by specialized manufacturer publishers, such as Buffet-Crampon, which was taken over first by Gouma, and later Evette and Schaffer, Gautreau-Aîné acquired by Quenon, and Millerot absorbed by Margherita. Because of the specific instrumentarium of wind bands, the production of this repertoire was the prerogative of specialist musicians, mostly with military background, who composed original works, but above all, transcriptions and arrangements that were produced en masse, whose styles and aesthetics remain strongly dependent on the regimental culture, marches, quick-step marches, divertissement. Throughout his career, Saint-Saëns worked closely with the greatest orchestrators of his time, such as Gabriel Pérez, Guillaume Ballet, and Barthélemy Girons. They orchestrated his own works and were entrusted with the musical arrangements. Among musicians trained outside the army, Saint-Saëns was once again an exception, committing himself to the composition and advancement of a scholarly repertoire for wind and brass bands, which he was not afraid to sometimes combine with the symphonic orchestra, the organ or the choir, as for instance his Grande Symphonie Triomphale for symphonic orchestra and wind band, or the musical performances for the Béziers Arena, putting together two wind bands, a harp ensemble, a string ensemble, narrators, and choirs.
The 30s and 40s of the 19th century can rightly be considered the golden age of wind instrument making. A series of breakthrough inventions emerged, with the main theme being improved tuning, increased sound power, adaptation of the mechanics to greater virtuosity, and the creation of homogeneous families of instruments. Saint-Saëns' first works for wind instruments, which appeared in the early 50s of the 19th century, coincided with the end of his golden age of invention, testing, and experimentation. The revolution, brought first by Stutzel and Blümel, then about jointly by Theobald Böhm and Adolphe Sax, had reached maturity, and Saint-Saëns was now able to take full advantage of stable, high-performance instruments equipped with all the technical innovations.
Finally, Saint-Saëns occupied in the second half of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century the place that the composers of the previous generation, that of Rossini, Meyerbeer, Halevi, and especially Berlioz, had in the promotion of wind instruments. He favored the integration of modern instruments in the orchestra, developed a new repertoire of chamber music, and created a quality repertoire for wind bands, becoming in a way the founder of a French wind tradition that his successors would claim. Thank you for your attention.